Well, here in Nigeria, the removal of petrol subsidy is still eliciting reactions from across the country's socio-political and economic landscapes. As we continue to bring these reactions to the front burner, we're now being joined by Nkoyo Toyo, who is a co-convener and spokesperson of Labour and Civil Society Front. We'll focus on measures that can ameliorate the adverse effects of the petrol subsidy removal on the citizens. Good to have you. Thank you for joining us on Newsday.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for your time as well. Well, let's just jump straight into solutions right now. You already know the situation. What would you say are immediate measures that need to be put in place to make this more bearable?
I really don't know whether it's a question of it being bearable. I think the point in question is that the issue of the removal of subsidies at the center of the kind of economy which we want to see in our country going forward. It's an economy that has to be sensitive to the needs of its citizens, and the majority of its citizens for that matter. I think hitherto what we have tended to have is a country that serves the interest of the elites. You see, for example, a police force that is concentrated on providing security for the elite class at the expense of the citizens of the country. And this is something we find in so many other spaces of national existence. So what we need to have now is an economy that serves the citizens of the country. And I think what we need to say, and I'm happy that the meeting that the Vice President had yesterday with the governors of the different states of the country, where they came to an understanding that there is pervading poverty. And as you very well know, we are the poverty headquarters of the world, with 133 million Nigerians living in multidimensional poverty, which means it's not just poverty that is income-based, it's also poverty that has to deal with many other aspects of life and the livelihoods that they live there that affect them. Therefore, it's interesting to see that that happened, and for the countries to say that, the country to begin to say that we need to do something about that, the poverty itself. If you listen to the speech and the conversation or the reportage that came out from yesterday, it was all centered around poverty. So this economy has to be, in terms of solutions, it has to be an economy that addresses the problems of poverty. And for me, to be honest with you, all I have heard is that subsidy has been removed, and the removal of subsidy doesn't necessarily equate dealing with the problem of poverty in the country. The consequences is that this poverty is going to deepen because fewer people are going to be able to afford the benefits that come with having a cheaper form of energy source. You're going to see small businesses like hairdressing salons, barbering salons, and all of that struggling. People who are sewing, struggling to find fuel and kerosene, petrol to run their generators and things like that. Of course, movement is going to be a major part of the problem. So small businesses are going to be affected, which means that the 33% unemployment that we have in the country is likely to deepen, and the situation is likely to get worse. But let's go to solutions. We have recognized the problem. The problem is a worsening of the already bad situation we have in terms of the nature of poverty. And there must be one poverty which I haven't spoken about, which I think the last government did recognize. That was a nutritional problem of hunger. A lot of people who cannot afford to feed themselves exist in this country. And that's why we had the school feeding program under the social investment program of Buhari, where children in school were given food to eat because they felt that those children didn't have enough food to eat and they weren't getting enough quality of food that they needed to have. So in the face of all of this, what are the solutions? The solutions are we have to start to understand the nature of this problem. What is the nature of the problem and what should be the answers to the problem? The first thing we need to think about, like I said, the economy must be one that begins to address. It must be very nimble in terms of its approach to how it deals with the problem, because the problems will unravel as we go along. We're just beginning to see it. If you travel in Abuja in the last 1 or 2 days, you'll notice that there's been a significant reduction in the number of vehicles that are on the roads, on the streets, which means some people may have just stopped going out for their businesses, or something has changed, or they're just being more careful about the use of the expensive fuel that they have. So things are beginning to change. So my suggestion, therefore, is that we must begin to look at how this impacts. A lot of people are going to be homeless. We need to have a strategy to deal with homelessness. People are not going to be able to afford the expenses, particularly in urban areas where they have to live in all sorts of unhealthy environments. We need to think about that. What are the strategies that we're going to have to deal with that? There are people who are going to be hungry because there's going to be less ability to afford the foods that they are able to eat, because inflation would have set in, the cost of food would have gone up. They're going to lose jobs because some businesses are going to come down because of this. Opportunities, which means that they're going to worsen the unemployment situation. And of course, the general lack of resource and lack of income is going to be a major problem. So these are the areas. And I want to say that the approach I have seen so far is talking about poverty, but not yet dealing with how poverty will be addressed. I guess we do also know that over time the humanitarian ministry has existed and has had the social investment program. But this is a worsening situation, and we have to ask ourselves whether those measures are measures that will be able to deal with the problem on ground.
Okay, thank you very much for setting the tone of this conversation as it regards to the solutions. Now, as a suitable alternative for Nigerians following the rising price of petrol, there's a new development where we're seeing in Innoson vehicle manufacturing, mass producing varieties of compressed natural gas buses. The vehicles range from trucks, minibuses, ambulances, long buses, SUVs, among others. Now, what other long-term creative measures can be put in place to reduce the vulnerability of citizens to fuel price fluctuations, and of course to ease the burden of subsidy removal? And are there any successful examples from other countries where fuel subsidy removal was implemented smoothly so that Nigeria can learn from those experiences?
Let me say that we shouldn't move too far away from the experiences in Nigeria. We do have quite a couple of things that we've done within the Nigerian context. Our problem has never been the shortage of ideas. Our problem has always been the problem of the corruption within those systems. The NPower program, for example, that tried to expand the scope of the scope of employment, which meant that it was able to bring in many more graduates onto the employment into the employment space, is a typical example where 30,000 naira was paid to so many families or so many new graduates, and they at least had an income. And the idea was that with that income, they would be able to start a life and stabilize, and in stabilizing, they will be able to think about alternative things they could do with themselves. That was a model of some kind of intervention that I think provided some stabilization. However, as always, the politicians came in from the National Assembly and wanted to have quotas. All sorts of interests came in. It ceased to be a purely graduate-driven program where they were trying to build the skills of the grower to becoming, of course, a rent-seeking affair, because I managed one of them in Cross River State in its first 4 years, and I know that at some point I got very pissed off with the whole thing, because all manner of persons were getting onto the employment portal and getting employed as the graduates, even when they were non-graduates, and a lot of abuses were happening with this. So it's not the question of what can be done and what is successful. It's a question of, do we have the discipline and the systems and the regulations and the ability, enforceability of those things to make them work for the people? If you bring any system or any example from anywhere in the world into Nigeria, the moment the system gets at it, the system will bring it down. Shopee was another example where we tried to promote small businesses and make sure the post-COVID interventions where small businesses got some amount of money to stabilize and not run out of business. There were examples of what existed. The mass transit, for example, that you are talking about. Here in Abuja, under the Jonathan era, we had buses all over the place to reduce the cost of transportation for people. These are examples that exist, but the problem is its implementation. The problem is its long-term management, the management of this thing, of these programs. I think there is something about us which we have refused to address, and that thing is largely the question of management of programs. And that is where we need to deal with and what we need to deal with. But let me step back a bit and say that is why we're very unhappy with the fact that we jumped at the question of removing subsidy. I must say that there was a national consensus. All the candidates said, look, take away subsidy. All the experts said, take away subsidy. We, the Nigerian people, got to a point that we said, we're tired of subsidy. Even Labour, that called the strike. Labour did not call the strike because they wanted subsidy to continue. They didn't call the strike. They called the strike to draw attention to the possible implications. And we must bear in mind that the implications are very, very different from the subsidy itself. The subsidy, as we know it today, has become a scam. Even the government talked about it. The vice president said there's a very powerful cartel that is behind this. So the question is that we didn't put the right measures in place. And you can see the government is now struggling to try to find what to do. Called the governors in yesterday, called the independent marketers in, and all sorts of things. This is an afterthought. We still haven't spoken to the people. We still haven't started dealing with the problems that will affect the people. We still haven't started looking at the implications for the economy. This is about turning around the whole fortunes of the country. This must count. I'm happy that Vice President Shettima said yesterday that there will be savings from this. But of course, as you know, nobody knows how much the savings is. Nobody has discussed what those savings are. We don't know why we ended up with the price of 5,530 in Lagos right now. We don't even know whether this represents the genuine value of the product or not. So there are a lot of unanswered questions, and there are a lot of other issues to be addressed. My point, therefore, is that we have solutions in Nigeria. We have programs and ways to deal with this. It has been with us since the times of Obasanjo. We must go back to some of those solutions. But the greatest problem, the greatest challenge for this government is how to deal with the culture of corruption. If they don't deal with the culture of corruption and rent-seeking in the system, any program that is put in place will suffer the same consequences.
Nkoyo, you've spoken very well and we're pressed for time. Briefly, we've seen some measures being taken by, on the gubernatorial level, where some states have reduced the number of work days. How do you see that? Do you think it will be effective in addressing this in any way, shape, or form?
I absolutely think that that's fabulous. But, now the world has changed, has transformed in many ways. A lot of people are working from home. We don't all have to be in an office space to be able to work. What this means is that the government of those two states where that has happened have to begin to introduce other ways of working with those people they've asked to come for a limited number of days. This is happening all over the world, so it's quite innovative. I hope they'll take it the next step and say to them, look, there are workstations in your neighborhood. We can create workstations in your neighborhood where you can go and have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 hours of data, of time on the internet or something, and do the work which you should have done physically in the office. People don't need to travel the long distances they travel every day to go to work. Work can be done from elsewhere, from outside. And I think the more we see the involvement of technology, and I think that is something we haven't used sufficiently in many regards, the more we use technology to solve some of these problems, then maybe the dependence on PMS will reduce, and the amount of PMS that we'll need to consume will come down. I think that's a very interesting type perspective, but it needs to be taken further down the line. The other thing it will do for us, of course, it will tackle some of the problems of corruption, because the less we depend on the human agents to deal with some of these things, the less we have their ability to undermine it and exploit it for their own uses.
All right, then thank you so much for being here on a Newsday. We appreciate your time.